You're probably a bit confused. Why am I wearing a Hawaiian shirt? Well, I'm wearing a Hawaiian shirt because I own a lot of Hawaiian shirts and I wanted to change it up. And let me tell you something. Recently, James White has been at it because a popular evangelical, Cameron Bertuzzi, has said he's closer to Rome than he's ever been, but he did say he's still a ways away. Cameron Bertuzzi's gotten close with Matt Fradd. Matt Fradd actually mentioned me not too long ago. No, sorry, he did mention me. Sam Jamu was on his show and he mentioned me. So, and I got some followers out of that. So thank you, Sam, and thank you, Matt. Oh, by the way, in 2014, I got to meet Matt Fradd. He came to my city for a conference. Okay. James White is at it again. He's at his old tricks. And let me just say, before I harshly criticize him, I want to give my props to Dr. White. Here's a book, The God Who Justifies, where he tries to argue for the Reformation doctrine. I hate the word Reformation. It's not a Reformation. It's a looting operation. Anyway, the doctrine, justification by faith alone. And in my opinion, he gives probably the best defense, at least the best defense I've read in this book. It's about 400 pages. And, he goes into the Greek and like, it's very in-depth. He's quoting lexicons and stuff. Give the guy credit. When it comes to exegesis, he can make a pretty good case. When it comes to church history, well, James White really ought to try his hand at something else. He really ought to try his hand at something else. I mean, he won, and you can tell this when you watch the debate from the 1990s between Syngenis and White on the Eucharist. Is the Mass biblical and ancient? And James White he can't stand what the early church thought about the Eucharist. Why? Because it blows a hole in his faith. He can't have this. This nullifies the gospel. And it nullifies his gospel, I agree. But it does not, it's not what the early church taught. The early church taught, they didn't use the word transubstantiation, but they essentially taught that. They believe it was the real presence, the physical presence of Christ. It was a sacrifice, and it was offered to God. And it changed at the words of consecration by priests and the bishops. That's just a plain reading of Scripture, of church history, which came from a plain reading of Scripture. This is my body, John chapter 6, and various other verses. So, what do we see here? We see a clear testimony, and James White just can't stand it because his 17th century religion doesn't allow it. And they believed in the Catholic doctrine. Now, there's a couple that didn't. There was Pope Galatius didn't believe in him. Maybe one or two others didn't. But it's essentially that doctrine. Now, and one thing he did in that debate was he quoted modern Protestants, Schaff and Cunningham, Pelican, Kelly, all these people over and over again. He's quoting that a Catholic. Oh, these modern Protestants believe the same thing I did, and they agree with me on what the early church believed. Well, so what? So what? I don't care if I said, oh, Scott Hahn or Brant Petrie agrees with me about what the early church said. Take that, James White. You're going to say, oh, they're biased. And they are. And they are. Why would you learn? See, church history, there's two ways to study church history. You can read modern Protestant stuff, like James White does. James White, if you look, he is going on about this really stupid argument he uses with the monarchical Rome. The Church of Rome didn't have an monarchical episcopate until the year approximately the mid-2nd century. And of course, none of the you quote Eusebius. You can see in Eusebius, I believe it's book 5 and book 3, talks about all the bishops that go back to Peter, Linus, several others, and yeah, that's what all the documents say. But White can't have that. So what does he do? He quotes 19th century Protestant historian J.B. Lightfoot. Here's what James White linked to. It's called Plurality of Elders at Rome. James White, August 15th, 2020. Oh, by the way, James, happy Feast of the Assumption. It says, I was just noting once again how modern readers who are attempting to shoehorn their current theologies into early church abuse those very writings. For example, it is well known among fair-minded scholars. He sounds like Shabir Ali here. Fair-minded scholars agree that the Trinity is a late doctrine. Jesus didn't teach it. The apostles didn't teach it. He sounds like Shabir Ali here. The multiple views of church government existed in the earliest period of the church. Plainly, the letter from the Church of Rome to the Church of Corinth shows that both continued to have the biblical model of plurality of elders. It is interesting to note the arguments put forward by such folks as Dr. Gentry regarding a very early date for that epistle. And clearly, it was a development, sounds like Shabir Ali again, that began in the East and moved westward, as Ignatius's letters attest. He plainly holds a monarchical view himself, and when writing to sees that already possessed that structure, he addresses the singular bishops, but he knows Rome does not have the structure, as the above epistle shows, and he does not, therefore, address a singular bishop. Those who embrace the anachronistic Roman primacy perspective cannot allow this to stand, and cannot imagine the kind of Catholicity that would allow Ignatius to hold one view while having fellowship with those with a different view. These same zealots might want to consider... I wonder if he thinks Eusebius is a zealot. These same zealots might want to consider how Irenaeus... By the way, St. Irenaeus has the monarchical bishops. He says, he gives the line of the bishops of the Church of Rome, going back to the beginning. And St. Irenaeus is in the late 2nd century. How Irenaeus basically told Victor to cool his jets when he threatened division over the Quartodeciman controversy about 60 or so years later. We should remember well the wise words of J.B. Lightfoot. For those who don't know, J.B. Lightfoot is a 19th century Protestant scholar. I bet you didn't see that one coming. See, James White, now it's true. Let's talk about St. Ignatius. When he writes to the Church of Rome, he doesn't identify a bishop who leads the church. He also doesn't identify a plurality of elders, so if that damages my position, it damages White's too. But why didn't he mention a bishop? I don't know. Ignatius isn't here. I can't ask him. It could be anything. It could be like persecution was bad in Rome, so maybe he didn't want to give the name of the bishop away in case it fell into the wrong hands. Notice that he doesn't name anyone in that letter. In a lot of his letters, he names not only the bishop, but individual priests and deacons too. He gives their name, like Sodio and other people. He gives the names. No names in the Church of Rome letter. Maybe it was for the safety of the people in that church in case the letter fell into wrong hands. That would be consistent with the later evidence that says there's a monarchical bishop there. But no. It must be no monarchical bishop, despite all the evidence. This is a conspiracy theory. So, you have James White. And you have someone like me. I like studying church history. James White claims to teach church history. That is frightening, ladies and gentlemen. He teaches what 19th century Protestants are believing. Why not just go back to the ancient church and read their historians? Why not read... Here, hold on. These are some of the books I read. Eusebius of Caesarea, early church historian, wrote from the time of history from the time of Christ to the just before the Council of Nicaea. Read him to learn about the early church. Don't read Lightfoot. Now, I know what James White will say. Well, he's 4th century. You can't trust what he says about Ignatius. Yet he's going off what a 19th century historian says about Ignatius. So yeah, read Eusebius. Also, read Theodoret. He's covers the 4th and the 5th century. You also have Sozomen, 4th and 5th century. Covers a lot of the same stuff as Theodoret. Socrates, 4th and 5th century, covers a lot of the same stuff as the previous two. By the way, a lot of evidence of papal supremacy in here, but that's not today's topic. The Ecclesiastical History of Evagrius Scholasticus, which is goes from 428 to 592. This historian was in Antioch. Published by Liverpool University Press. And you also have... Here's one more that's fun to read. The Ecclesiastical History of the English People by Venerable Bede. Shout out to my buddy Correns. So there you go. That's the kind of stuff I study for the early church. That's what I study. I try to go as early as possible. I got many more things like that too. Now, do I read modern church history stuff? Yes. I read Warren Carroll. I got the 5-volume church history thing there, and I've quoted it in other videos. Is it bad to read Warren Carroll? No, it's not bad to read Warren Carroll. But if Warren Carroll says something that all of the early evidence disagrees with, guess whose opinion I'm going to chuck? It's not these people. It's Warren Carroll. Warren Carroll, that's who I'm going to chuck. Because I don't... The idea of using... Or historians aren't meant to refute history. That's what White's doing. And there was a debate with Tim Staples and James White where they talked about papal infallibility. Oh, that's good. Talked about papal infallibility. And Tim Staples pointed out in the debate, by the way, I'm quoting a 4th century, it was 4th or 5th century historian here, not a 19th century Protestant, because that's all White does.
Why does he then, and I quote from Sozomen's, now this is a 4th century historian, not a 19th century Protestant historian. From the 4th century, he writes, fearing perhaps...
He gets it all from modern Protestants. His views of the medieval church all come from Schaff and people who have an axe to grind. Schaff's an Anglican. I don't trust Anglican history. I don't trust, because the whole idea of the Anglican history is a contradiction. Their whole church is a contradiction. By the way, James White's not the only one that does this pseudo-history stuff. For example, there's a popular thing amongst the Orthodox Church. There's this pseudo... I think it's an insult to pseudo-historians to call this guy a pseudo-historian. It's Vladimir Moss. Let's call him a joke. I'll call him a joke. Vladimir Moss, who wrote this, The Fall of Orthodox England. And he talked about how William the Conqueror led his papist army to defeat the Orthodox country of England under Harold Godwinson. And he was the last Orthodox king. You read Venerable Bede, I like to tell these people, in the year 680, It was our 680 or 681. I can't remember the exact year. But it's in this book. There's a synod in England where they produce a creed that has the filioque in it. And it's approved by the Archbishop of Canterbury, who's a Byzantine Archbishop, Theodore. And it's sent to Rome and approved by Pope Agatho, who's an Orthodox Pope. So much for England being an Orthodox country that William the Conqueror destroyed. No, that's, like I said, it's an insult to pseudo-historians to call that pseudo-history. It's even worse than that. But James White has pseudo-history too. There's no one in the first 1,000 years, 1,500 years, who says there was no monarchical episcopate till about 200 or so. You can or till about 150. You can find many lists of the bishops of Rome, including Eusebius, and none of them start in the mid-4th or mid-2nd century. Well, the year 150, they start to get that monarchical bishop going. No. Well, Lightfoot disagrees. Well, screw Lightfoot. I don't care what modern Protestants say, unless it's in accord with the ancient evidence. I'm winding down here, but I have an appeal to James White. If you see this, friends of James White, if you want to send this to him, please do. James, do you want me to chuck all these, chuck them, or stop studying them anyway, and replace them with Schaff and Lightfoot and J&D Kelly? Because I guess I'm doing it all wrong. All I had to do is read modern Protestants. I've spent years studying the ancient church from ancient church sources. So tell me why I should give that up and read Lightfoot and Schaff and Yaroslav Pelikan and Cunningham. Because in that debate with Syngenes, all you did was quote Protestants. All you did. One after the other. You quoted Protestants over and over and over again. And if a 19th century Protestant is talking about Protestantism in the 19th century, I'll take his word for it. Or maybe the 18th century. But in terms of what happened in the early church, I'm going to trust the early church. I'm going to trust Eusebius. I'm going to trust the early documents. I'm going to trust St. Ignatius. Yes, Ignatius doesn't list a monarchical bishop. That doesn't mean there was not one there. He doesn't list a plurality of elders either. So James, tell me why I should chuck the ancient evidence and go with your modern Protestants. I know the reason. The reason is because they'll just say they'll try to rob the Catholicity of the early church. That's the reason. Well, I have no interest in that. I want to learn about the early church from documents from the early church. You can read all the Lightfoot you want. But honestly, when Lightfoot contradicts plain history, I have to reject them. Just like if someone says nonsense from Scripture. When we look at Matthew Vines trying to justify sodomy from the Bible, are we going to take him seriously? Absolutely not. Why? Because the Scripture is obvious. Matthew 19 is obvious. 1 Corinthians is obvious. The whole milieu, Genesis 1, 2, and 3, is very obvious. We know what's going on. We know what Genesis 19 says. We know what the Scripture and the church that Christ gave us said about this stuff. And Matthew Vines comes along. Well, honestly, I think I'm going to throw this argument in the same category as the Matthew Vines stuff. Because you can quote modern Protestants for that. They're super apostate Protestants, but I would say like the 19th century Anglican Church was pretty much a joke as well. That's why you had the Oxford movement, where people were looking at the ancient church from ancient sources and saying, we don't want none of this. So anyway, I'm going to show you at the end of this video a compilation of James White in his debate with Robert Sungenis in 1990, I can't remember the year. And I'm just, each time he quotes a modern Protestant to try to prove his point, whether it's Pelican, Schaff, J.N.D. Kelly, or Cunningham, these modern Protestants, no, I'm going with, if I want to know what the early church taught about the Eucharist, I'll go read them. I study the early church all the time, and the medieval church, and the modern church. But I do it with appropriate material, not conspiracy theories dreamed up by heretics in the 19th century. It's not going to work. So, I hope you enjoy the compilation. God bless.
Constant faith of the church. The renowned historian Philip Schaff notes, quote, "In both cases, the conflict was between a materialistic and a spiritualistic conception of the sacrament and its effect. Consecrated hosts literally explode in number only after the beginning of the second millennium." Just as an example, I again cite from Schaff. Another case related by Etienne of Bourbon is of a farmer who, wanting to be rich, church while the bees singing songs flew away. Schaff says, these stories, which might be greatly multiplied, and he provides a number in his history, attest the profound veneration which the host was held and the crude superstitions which grew up around it in the convent and among the people. And here's Schaff's comment, the simple and edifying communion meal of the new... And ask him what he thought anathema meant. In regards to Augustine's view and the view that there were many people who held this symbolic view, I refer you to people like Schaff, Pelican, Cunningham, J.N.D. Kelly, all scholars of the first rank. You don't have to take my word for it. Do your homework yourself. You will see that that's the case.
Do not say that we adore or worship the Eucharist. I'll read you a quote from Augustine. You tell me what you think about it.
I did not say that, sir.
Okay, tell me what you did say.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. What I said was that all scholars with whom I am familiar with will specifically make the statement as, for example, Schaff does right here. In the previous period, we distinguished three views. The mystic view.
And not only do we not sin by adoring it, we do sin by not adoring it.
Is that a question I can answer?
Yeah, tell me what you think of that.
Thank you. Well, I think when you read Augustine, you understand why it is that Schaff, Pelican, Cunningham, J.N.D. Kelly, and everyone else understands why he did not hold to a materialistic view.
Telling us, and Mr. White, correct me if I'm wrong, is that when the fathers talk about real presence, about Christ's bodily presence, all these passages I quoted you from the fathers, that they are really talking about a spiritual presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Is that correct?
I have indicated a number of times in quoting from Schaff and others that there were numerous views and numerous ideas that were present in the early fathers. Pelican himself points out that there was no firm, clear doctrine.
Name anybody else who had that same view.
I mentioned in my opening statement, I quoted at least two of the early church fathers who, and specifically, I quoted Tertullian and Theodoret.
Can you give me